All right, today we're diving into a real revolution in how we see the mind. We're moving away from the idea of the mind as this collection of tiny, separate pieces and into something whole, something dynamic, and honestly, something often pretty surprising. This is the story of the Gestalt Revolution.
You know, this entire movement was really driven by this one single powerful question. For decades, psychology had been obsessed with trying to break consciousness down into its smallest possible atoms. But then, this new wave of German thinkers came along and asked, hey, what if we're missing the forest for the trees? What if the whole picture is what truly matters?
Okay, let's really get into this. On one side, you've got structuralism. They saw the mind as just a big pile of individual bricks, sensations, images, feelings. But on the other side, you have Gestalt psychology, which argued that the mind is the entire building. I mean, you can't understand a house by just studying one brick at a time, right? You have to see how they all work together to create something completely new.
But before this new building could really be appreciated, the old brick factory kind of had to go out of business. So let's start at the end, the dead end of structuralism, to see exactly why this Gestalt revolution was so necessary.
This analogy just nails it, doesn't it? The guy in charge, a psychologist named Edward Titchener, and his followers were absolutely obsessed with identifying the basic elements of consciousness. They truly believed that if they could just create this perfect, complete catalog of all the mental parts, they'd finally understand the mind. But they were missing the big picture entirely.
So structuralism really fell apart for a few key reasons. First, its main method, called introspection, was just not reliable. Different labs would get totally different results. Second, this claim of having found 44,000 mental elements, it was completely arbitrary, basically just pulled out of thin air. Third, its scope was just way too narrow. It totally ignored real-world applications. And finally, it was deeply elitist. Its leader, Titchener, even excluded women from his core group of experimentalists.
And this really shows the school's biggest weakness. It wasn't so much a scientific movement as it was a cult of personality. The moment Titchener died, poof, the whole thing just vanished with him. The search for mental bricks was officially a dead end.
Okay, so with structuralism basically toast, psychology desperately needed a new foundation, a much more rigorous one. And that foundation wasn't going to be built on subjective reports. It was going to be built on math.
This is the date. This is when everything changed. It's actually known as Fechner Day. A guy named Gustav Fechner is lying in bed and he has this incredible revolutionary insight. The relationship between a physical thing out in the world and the subjective feeling you have in your mind, well, it could be described with a mathematical equation. The mind could actually be measured.
And this is that very equation. Now, I know it might look a little intimidating, but the idea is actually super simple. Think about it like this. Adding one candle to a pitch-black room feels dramatic, right? But adding one more candle to a room that's already brightly lit, you'd barely even notice. The physical change is the same, one candle, but your subjective experience, your sensation, is wildly different. Fechner realized this relationship wasn't a straight line, it was logarithmic. So let's break this down. S is your subjective sensation, R is the rise, that's a German word for the physical stimulus, the K is just a constant value that changes for different senses, like sight versus sound, and the log, the logarithm, that's the key relationship. As the stimulus gets more intense, you need bigger and bigger changes to even notice a difference. This simple-looking equation meant that for the very first time, psychology could actually be a quantitative science.
And Fechner wasn't totally alone in building this new scientific foundation. History often forgets some really key figures, like Ebbinghaus, who pioneered memory research, or Cope, who discovered something called imageless thought. And then you've got Stump, who actually mentored the guys who founded Gestalt psychology. These thinkers were absolutely crucial in setting the stage for what came next.
So with the old ways failing and this new scientific rigor in the air, the stage was finally set for the central, knockout idea of the Gestalt Revolution. Now, the word Gestalt itself is German. It means a whole, a form, or a configuration. And its core principle is famously paraphrased, but the exact wording here is super important. It's not that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It's that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Think of a melody. It's different from just a random collection of individual notes. The notes are the parts, but the melody, that's the Gestalt.
And this huge principle was born from a surprisingly simple experiment back in 1912 by Max Wertheimer. He showed people two lights that flashed one after another very quickly. Now, nobody perceived two separate flashes.
Instead, they saw a single light moving through space from one spot to the other. The sensory parts are just two stationary lights blinking, but the perceived whole is motion. Your brain is actively organizing the input into a meaningful gestalt.
And this wasn't just about perception or blinking lights. The Gestalt pioneers quickly realized this holistic approach could totally revolutionize our understanding of learning and problem solving. It's really about how we learn to, well, literally think outside the box.
To prove this, Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Kohler set up this now famous experiment on the island of Tenerife. He put a chimpanzee named Sultan in a room with a banana hanging from the ceiling just out of his reach. And scattered around the room were some boxes and sticks. The big question was, how would Sultan solve this problem?
Now, the dominant theory at the time, behaviorism, predicted that Sultan would just try a bunch of random things, jumping around, throwing sticks, until he accidentally stumbled on a solution. But the Gestalt prediction was completely different. They believed Sultan would have a sudden moment of insight, a real aha moment, where he'd see the solution all at once. And that's exactly what happened. Sultan sat down for a bit, surveyed the whole scene, and then all of a sudden, he got up with a clear purpose. He stacked the boxes, climbed right up, and grabbed that banana. He didn't learn through random trial and error. He learned by mentally reorganizing the pieces of the room into a new whole. The boxes weren't just boxes anymore. They were a staircase. That right there is the power of insight.
This whole idea of the mind always seeking a complete, organized whole, well, it extends way beyond perception and problem solving. It also explains some really powerful forces in our daily lives, things like motivation and memory.
Here's a classic example. A student from the Gestalt school, Bluma Zygarnik, was sitting in a cafe and noticed something really strange. The waiters had a flawless memory for all these complex, unpaid orders. But the second the bill was paid, they completely forgot what the table had even ordered. So what was going on?
Well, this became known as the Zygarnik effect. An unfinished task, like an unpaid bill, creates a state of psychological tension in our minds. Our brain craves completion. It wants to close the Gestalt. That tension keeps the task front and center in your memory. Once it's done, the tension is released, and the memory just fades away. It's the same reason cliffhangers on TV shows are so darn effective.
This concept of psychological tension was absolutely central to the work of another giant in this tradition, Kurt Lewin. He created what he called field theory, and he summed it up in this incredibly elegant formula. Behavior is a function of the person and their environment.
The huge takeaway here is that you can't understand behavior by only looking at someone's personality, the P, or just the situation they're in, the E, in isolation. You have to see the interaction of both. And, this is the really important part, E isn't the objective environment, it's the environment as you perceive it. This holistic, dynamic view of what makes us tick was revolutionary, and it became the foundation for modern social psychology.
And this brings us right back to a final thought for you. Think about what you're going to do right after this is over. According to Lewin, that decision isn't just a product of your personality or what's on your to-do list. It's a function of the entire psychological field you're in right now. It's a product of both you, the person, and your perceived world, interacting to create one single holistic action, the Gestalt.